For over a decade, I let my sister mock me as a lowly secretary. I sat quietly at the family dinner table while her arrogant Admiral husband treated me like the dirt on his expensive shoes. I never said a single word. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just filing papers. And the day his entire naval fleet sailed directly into a deadly, classified trap, the only person on Earth with the security clearance to save his life was me. He walked into the most secure bunker in the Pentagon, expecting to shout at a faceless commander. Instead, his knees buckled when the lights snapped on, and he saw his pathetic sister-in-law wearing the silver stars of Phantom 6. This is a story about why you should never shrink yourself to make toxic people comfortable, and how true power doesn't need to shout. It just waits for the right moment to strike. If you have ever been underestimated, judged, or made to feel invisible by the people who should have loved you most, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with a woman who needs to reclaim her power. Subscribe to our channel, and let me know in the comments. When did you finally stop settling for less? Let's begin. The clinking of crystal wine glasses sounded like a judge's gavel striking a wooden block, echoing sharply over the low hum of dinner conversation. I kept my eyes fixed on the remaining swirl of red wine in my glass, refusing to give my sister the satisfaction of a reaction. I just don't understand why you insist on wearing those uninspired orthopedic shoes, Ellie, Clara said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of suburban pity she had spent a decade perfecting. It's like you are actively trying to look like a desperate temporary hire. I mean, you work in an administrative pool. Surely they expect a baseline of professionalism. Arthur, her husband, let out a low, rumbling chuckle. He leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. As a newly minted admiral, Arthur wore his arrogance like a second skin. He looked at me with the dismissive gaze of a man who measured human worth strictly by military rank and the price tag on a wristwatch. Now, Clara, don't be too hard on Eleanor, Arthur drawled, taking a slow sip of his top-shelf bourbon. The Pentagon needs someone to file the travel vouchers and organize the coffee stations. It's an honest, albeit entirely unremarkable, living. Not everyone is cut out for the burden of real leadership. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin on the table or storm out of the restaurant. I simply took a breath and offered a mild, placating nod. I had spent my entire life making myself small so my sister could feel big. Her narcissistic ego required constant feeding, and my assigned role in this family was the invisible, unremarkable spinster. As I looked across the table at Arthur's smug expression, a quiet realization settled over me. True power does not need to shout. True power does not demand to be seen. Sometimes, it just waits patiently in the shadows for arrogance to walk right into its crosshairs. An hour later, the freezing evening wind whipped through the streets of Washington, D.C. As I walked up the steps to a quiet brownstone. My hands were trembling, but not from the biting chill in the air. I let myself in, dropping my keys onto the entryway table. Julian was waiting in the dimly lit living room. Dr. Julian Hayes, a brilliant trauma surgeon at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, possessed the kind of quiet, grounding strength that made the rest of the world melt away. He took one look at my pale face and the rigid set of my jaw, and he knew exactly what kind of evening I had endured. He didn't ask about the dinner. He didn't ask what Clara had said. He simply walked over, his eyes softening, and gently guided me to the edge of the velvet sofa. "Take the jacket off, Ellie," Julian murmured, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "You're holding your breath again." My fingers were stiff as I unbuttoned my coat and slipped it off my shoulders. I unbuttoned the top of my blouse, exposing the thick, sterile gauze taped securely over my collarbone. It was a vicious, jagged wound, a parting gift from a highly classified extraction gone wrong 3 months ago, a reality my family could never comprehend. Julian knelt in front of me, his hands, steady and warm, expertly peeled away the medical tape. A sharp hiss of pain escaped my lips as the cold air hit the healing scar tissue. Julian paused, his thumb gently brushing the uninjured skin of my neck. "It's healing well," he said softly, applying a fresh layer of antiseptic. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine. The unwavering respect in his gaze was almost too much to bear after hours of being treated like a disposable servant. "You coordinate the movements of entire fleets. You save thousands of lives in the darkest corners of the globe, Ellie. When are you going to stop letting them destroy yours?" A single tear spilled over my lashes, tracing a hot path down my cheek. I leaned my forehead against his shoulder, finally allowing the heavy armor of Phantom 6 to crack. "Because they are my family. Julian," I whispered into the fabric of his shirt. "And if I drop the mask, I lose them forever." Julian wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a fiercely protective embrace. "Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, Eleanor, not a battlefield. You don't have to bleed out just to keep them comfortable." It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the carefully constructed illusion of Clara's perfect, untouchable life finally cracked. I had stopped by her sprawling suburban house to drop off a birthday gift for her golden retriever. Clara was at the salon, as usual, leaving the housekeeper to let me in. As I set the gift bag on the kitchen island, a bright red envelope protruding from the overflowing trash bin caught my eye. It was entirely out of place in Clara's meticulously curated home. Against my better judgment, I pulled it out. It was a final, aggressive notice from the elite Oak Ridge Country Club. It detailed a staggering mountain of secret, unpaid credit card debt. Clara was drowning. Behind the designer purses, the lavish dinner parties, and the constant boasting about her Admiral husband. My sister was desperately shuffling funds to maintain a facade she could not afford. Arthur, obsessed with his own image, clearly had no idea. And the stress of it was likely fueling Clara's escalating cruelty toward me. I stood in the silent, cavernous kitchen, holding the paper that could destroy her marriage. The urge to leave it on Arthur's desk was a brief, bitter flash in my mind, but the resentment faded, replaced by a heavy, aching pity. I folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. That night, sitting in the secure glow of my encrypted terminal, I transferred a massive sum from my offshore hazard pay account directly to the country club, wiping the debt completely clean. I left no name. I didn't do it to be a martyr. I did it because family, even broken, toxic ones, shouldn't be left to drown when you have the power to throw them a life raft. Compassion, I reminded myself, was a choice, not a transaction. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom of the Mayflower Hotel was electric. It was the official Navy gala celebrating Arthur's promotion to command a major Pacific fleet. The room was a sea of glittering evening gowns and blindingly white dress uniforms stacked with shiny medals. I arrived wearing a simple, elegant navy dress, hoping to remain in the background. My hopes were instantly shattered when I approached the seating chart. Clara had placed me at table 42, tucked away in a dark corner near the kitchen doors, seated with the teenage children of junior officers. Arthur spotted me near the entrance. He swaggered over, a champagne flute balanced in his hand, his chest puffed out like a peacock. "Eleanor," he greeted, his tone laced with mock sympathy. "I hope you don't mind the seating arrangement. The main tables are reserved for senior command staff and foreign dignitaries. I simply couldn't risk have someone seen with your limited professional exposure struggling to keep up with the conversation. We need to project a certain level of power tonight before I could formulate a polite, neutral response." A warm, heavy hand settled onto the small of my back. Julian stepped up beside me. He wasn't wearing a military uniform, just a classic, immaculately tailored black tuxedo that made him look like old Hollywood royalty. "I find that fascinating, Admiral," Julian said, his voice smooth and carrying effortlessly over the string quartet playing nearby. Arthur's smug smile faltered slightly as he looked Julian up and down. "And you are Dr. Julian Hayes," he replied, extending a hand that Arthur reluctantly shook. I spend my days pulling shrapnel out of the men and women who actually fight on the front lines, while you sit in air-conditioned offices moving pieces on a board. And having spoken to Eleanor extensively, I can assure you that her intellect vastly outpaces anyone in this room. Clara, who had just rushed over, gasped, "Excuse me. You are speaking to an admiral." Julian didn't raise his voice. But the sudden, icy authority in his eyes made Arthur physically take a step back. "I am speaking to a man who believes a gold pin on his collar gives him the right to belittle the woman standing in front of him, a woman who possesses more grace, integrity, and quiet fortitude in her little finger than you have accumulated in your entire career." Julian turned to me, offering his arm with a soft, protective smile. "Shall we go find our table? Ellie, the air is getting a bit stale over here." As I took his arm and walked away from my stunned sister and her seething husband, my heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I had spent years hiding in the shadows, accepting the disrespect as a necessary tax for peace. But feeling Julian's unwavering support anchoring me to the floor, a new spark ignited in my chest. The era of silences was rapidly coming to an end. The secure elevator plunged 2 stories beneath the Pentagon, the heavy steel doors sealing me away from the civilian world and delivering me into the freezing, windowless expanse of the Strategic Operations Center, down here. I was no longer the spinster sister or the lowly administrative assistant who filed travel vouchers. I was Phantom 6. The air in the sensitive compartmented information facility, or SIF, was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. A sprawling wall of digital maps bathed the room in a harsh, neon green glow. My team of senior intelligence analysts was already scrambling when I swiped my clearance badge and took my seat at the center console. The Pacific Theater was flashing a violent, urgent red. A massive, unpredicted hostile movement had materialized off the coast of a contested island chain. My fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard, pulling up the real-time satellite feeds. My blood ran cold as the tactical grid fully rendered. Admiral Arthur Sterling's carrier strike group was steaming at full speed directly into the sector. They were sailing blind into a highly coordinated, multi-directional ambush in less than 2 hours. His entire fleet would be surrounded by undetectable surface-to-air missile batteries and silent attack submarines. It was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen, and Arthur was marching 3,000 sailors right through the front door. How did the forward reconnaissance team miss this? I demanded, my voice cutting through the frantic chatter of the room. I rapidly accessed the fleet's internal intelligence logs, bypassing Arthur's restricted firewall with my executive clearance. I needed to know if they had been jammed, or if this was a catastrophic failure of observation. The truth, when it popped up on my screen, was far more sickening than a technical glitch. It was a redacted intelligence memo marked with the highest level of urgency, filed 3 days ago by a junior female analyst named Ensign Sarah Jenkins. She had noticed the subtle anomalies in the hostile radar patterns and correctly predicted the exact ambush coordinates. But across the top of her meticulous report was a glaring digital stamp, bearing Arthur's official signature. Beneath it, he had typed a single, devastatingly arrogant sentence. Dismissed. Source lacks senior rank and operational field experience. A wave of pure, unfiltered fury washed over me. Arthur's fragile, inflated ego had blinded him to the truth. Because the warning came from a young woman at the bottom of the military hierarchy, he had swiped it away like a piece of meaningless trash. He judged her the exact same way he judged me by the lack of heavy brass on her collar, because of his elitist pride. 3,000 innocent sons, daughters, husbands and wives were about to die in the dark waters of the Pacific. The primary communication channel flashed. General Marcus Vance from the Joint Chiefs of Staff was on the secure line. Phantom 6. We are seeing the trap. The general's voice barked over the speaker. Admiral Sterling has compromised the entire theater. We are preparing to immediately relieve him of command and send in a rescue armada. His career is over. We will court-martial him the second he touches American soil. I stared at the blinking red dots on the screen. Stripping Arthur of his command right now would mean absolute, public ruin. He would face federal prison. And Clara's fragile, desperate world would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The temptation to let him fall was a dark, seductive whisper in the back of my mind. He had mocked me, belittled me, and treated me like dirt on his shoe for over a decade. This was the ultimate karma. But then I thought of Julian's words. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary. Eleanor, not a battlefield. I thought of the terrified sailors on those ships who would panic if their command structure collapsed mid-crisis. I was not Clara. I was not Arthur. I did not destroy people to make myself feel powerful. Negative, General, I said, my voice as hard and cold as cut diamond. A sudden decapitation of leadership will cause panic on the decks. I am overriding the Joint Chiefs. Ground Admiral Sterling immediately. Pull him off the command ship via a stealth transport and bring him directly to my bunker here in D.C. I will take direct remote control of the fleet's tactical evasion, and I will do it with him in the room. There was a heavy pause on the line before the general conceded to my absolute authority. The trap was set. But this time, the rescue mission was about saving a man from his own toxic arrogance. The heavy, copper-lined vault door of the SIF groaned on its massive hinges, the electronic deadbolt sliding back with a sharp, metallic shriek. I sat in the shadows at the head of the long glass briefing table, my hands folded perfectly still over the polished surface. I was no longer wearing my civilian clothes. I wore my immaculately pressed dress uniform, the heavy silver stars of my actual rank gleaming on my shoulders, and the matte black identification plate of Fan 6 resting over my heart. Admiral Arthur Sterling stormed into the room, bringing the bitter chill of the hallway with him. His pristine white uniform was rumpled, and his face was flushed with indignant rage. He had been yanked from his flagship by heavily armed special operatives without explanation, flown across the world, and dumped into this underground bunker. He was furious, expecting to shout down whichever faceless Washington bureaucrat had dared to interrupt his glorious command. He marched toward the center of the room, his chest puffed out, opening his mouth to unleash a torrent of arrogant fury. Listen to me. You desk, Arthur began, his voice booming. The overhead halogen lights snapped on, flooding the head of the table in a brilliant, blinding white glare. It caught the silver stars on my shoulders. It illuminated the jagged scar on my collarbone peeking out from my collar, and it perfectly framed my face. I did not move. I did not smile. I just looked at him. Time in the bunker seemed to physically stop. I watched a man's entire reality disintegrate in the span of 3 agonizing seconds. The pupils of Arthur's eyes shrank to pinpricks. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky gray against the stiff collar of his white uniform. The arrogant swagger completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent tremor in his hands. His knees actually buckled, forcing him to grab the back of a leather chair to keep from hitting the floor. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land, as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible. The quiet, boring sister-in-law he had relentlessly mocked over dinner was sitting in the apex predator seat of the United States military. Phantom 6. Arthur whispered. The words scraped out of his dry throat, sounding completely broken. Take a seat, Admiral, I said. My voice was a calm, steady current. Arthur collapsed into the chair, his chest heaving. He looked like a man waiting for an executioner's axe to fall. He knew I had the power to annihilate his life with a single signature. Instead, I reached across the glass table and slid a single piece of paper toward him. It was Ensign Sarah Jenkins's intelligence report, complete with his dismissive digital stamp. You measure a person's worth by the weight of the medals on their chest, Arthur, I said, my tone stripping away the last of his defenses. You measure value by zip codes, by designer labels, and by rank, because of that fatal arrogance. You ignored the brilliant work of a junior female analyst. Because of your pride, you almost killed 3,000 sons, daughters, And husbands today. True leadership is not about standing above people. It is about listening to the lowest rank in the room. Because sometimes they are the only ones holding the lantern in the dark. Tears, hot and humiliated, welled up in Arthur's eyes. The invincible Admiral was weeping silently, his ego entirely crushed under the weight of his own profound failure. "I could end you right now," I continued softly. "The Joint Chiefs wanted you in federal prison. But I am not going to destroy you, Arthur, because out on that water, there are 3,000 people who just want to go home to their families. And we are going to make sure they do." I tapped the glass screen embedded in my desk, bringing up the live tactical feed of his trapped fleet. "Pick up your encrypted radio. Admiral, I am going to feed you the exact evasion coordinates. You are going to give the orders to your captains. You are going to save your people." Arthur stared at me, completely shattered by the profound grace I was offering him. Grace he had never once extended to me. With a shaking hand, he picked up the radio microphone. For the next 3 hours, we worked in absolute synchronicity. I mapped the blind spots in the enemy radar, and Arthur relayed the commands, guiding his massive ships through the invisible needle of the ambush. When the final carrier cleared the hostile zone, the room fell silent. Arthur lowered the radio. He looked across the table at me, no longer seeing a lowly secretary, but finally seeing a leader, a savior, and a sister. The afternoon sun filtered beautifully through the sheer linen curtains of the Sterling residence, casting a warm, golden glow over the immaculate kitchen. Clara stood at the sprawling marble island, carefully arranging a bouquet of imported white hydrangeas in a crystal vase. She was humming a soft tune, wrapped in the comforting, expensive cashmere of her fabricated reality. Tomorrow, she was hosting a charity luncheon for the wives of the Senior Naval Command, a highly anticipated event where she intended to casually drop the name of her sister's unimpressive administrative job just to highlight her own elevated status. Clara thrived on the contrast. My manufactured smallness was the foundation upon which she built her towering, fragile castle. The heavy oak front door opened, breaking the serene silence of the house. Clara did not look up from her flowers, assuming it was the housekeeper returning from errands. But the footsteps echoing down the hardwood hallway were heavy, dragging and profoundly out of rhythm. Clara finally turned, an impatient reprimand dying instantly on her lips. Arthur stood in the arched doorway of the kitchen. He looked like a ghost who had survived a harrowing walk through hell. His usually pristine white dress uniform was horribly wrinkled, the collar unbuttoned, and the tie hanging loosely around his neck. The arrogant, puffed-out chest that had defined his entire persona was gone, replaced by a hollow, sunken posture. His eyes were bloodshot, staring blankly at the spotless kitchen floor, as if he could not comprehend how the world could look so normal when his own had just violently ended and restarted. "Arthur," Clara gasped, dropping a stem of hydrangea onto the counter. She rushed toward him, her hands hovering nervously over his chest, afraid to touch the expensive fabric. "What happened? You were supposed to be leading the Pacific Fleet. Why are you home? Has there been an accident?" Arthur slowly lifted his head. He looked at his wife, truly seeing the desperation in her eyes, the desperate need for everything to be perfect and prestigious. Without saying a word, he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. His hand was trembling slightly. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper and placed it gently onto the marble counter, right next to the crystal vase. Clara frowned, reaching for the paper. She unfolded it, her manicured fingers suddenly freezing. All the color drained from her perfectly powdered face. It was the final, aggressive notice from the elite Oak Ridge Country Club, detailing the staggering mountain of secret, unpaid credit card debt she had been hiding for over a year. Next to it was a printed confirmation of a massive wire transfer, showing the debt had been paid in full, down to the last humiliating cent. "Arthur, I can explain," Clara stammered, her voice pitching into a panicked, high-frequency whine. Tears of sheer terror sprang to her eyes. She expected him to yell, to scream about betrayal, to demand a divorce for jeopardizing his precious security clearance. I was going to figure it out. The luncheons, the clothes. You expect me to look a certain way. I had to keep up appearances for your career. Stop, Arthur said. His voice was not angry. It was a hollow, broken rasp. I didn't pay it. Clara, I never knew about it. Clara blinked, her mind frantically trying to process the information. If you didn't pay it, who did? Arthur leaned heavily against the island, resting his face in his hands. Your sister. Eleanor paid it. 2 weeks ago. She quietly transferred the money from a classified, off-the-books hazard pay account. She saved you from total financial and social ruin, and she never said a single word about it. Clara physically recoiled as if she had been struck. Ellie, that's impossible. She's just a lowly secretary. She makes a fraction of what you do. How could she possibly have that kind of money, let alone a classified account? Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded more like a sob. He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears of profound humiliation. Because she is not a secretary, Clara. She never was. The woman we have been mocking. The woman we stuck at the back table with the children. The woman you belittled just to feel better about yourself. She is the Joint Strategic Commander. Her call sign is Phantom 6. She holds the highest operational clearance in the United States military. Clara's mouth fell open, but absolutely no sound came out. She grabbed the edge of the marble counter to keep her legs from giving way beneath her. I sailed my entire fleet directly into a lethal ambush today because I refused to listen to a junior analyst, Arthur confessed, the weight of his own arrogance finally crushing him. I was going to get 3,000 of my own people killed. The Joint Chiefs wanted to throw me in federal prison. But Eleanor, she overrode them. She pulled me into her bunker. She sat me down at her table. And instead of destroying me for the decade of cruelty we put her through, she patiently guided me on how to save my ships. She gave me grace, Clara. She gave me the very mercy we constantly denied her. Arthur pushed himself off the counter and looked at his wife with a heartbreaking clarity. We have been living a lie, Clara, both of us. And the only person holding our lives together was the exact person we spent our lives tearing down. Clara sank slowly to the kitchen floor, burying her face in her hands as the ugly, suffocating truth of her own cruelty finally broke her. A gentle morning rain was falling over Washington, D.C., tapping softly against the bay windows of my brownstone. I was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in a thick, oversized wool sweater, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. Julian was standing by the stove, flipping pancakes with a quiet, domestic rhythm that felt like a healing balm to my exhausted soul. I had not been called back to the bunker. For the first time in years, the Phantom was allowed to rest. A timid, hesitant knock sounded at the front door. Julian paused, glancing at me over his shoulder. I took a deep breath, setting my coffee mug down on the wooden table. I already knew who was standing on the other side of that door. I walked down the hallway and pulled the heavy door open. Clara stood on my front porch, shivering in the damp morning air. She was entirely stripped of her suburban armor. She wasn't wearing a designer trench coat or an expensive leather handbag. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was completely bare of makeup, her eyes red and severely swollen from hours of violent weeping. She looked incredibly small, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the need to shrink myself to match her. Ellie, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply collapsed forward, wrapping her arms tightly around my waist, burying her face in my shoulder as she began to sob unconditionally. I stood in the doorway, the cool rain blowing onto the porch, and I slowly raised my arms, resting my hands gently on her shaking back. I am so sorry. Clara choked out, the words muffled against my sweater. I am so incredibly sorry. Arthur told me everything. He told me what you did for the fleet. And he told me about the country club. You saved my marriage. You saved my home and I treated you like garbage. I used you to hide how pathetic and insecure I felt inside. I needed you to be a failure so I wouldn't have to face my own. Please, Ellie, please forgive me. I held her for a long moment, letting her cry out a decade of toxic poison. Then, I gently but firmly placed my hands on her shoulders and pushed her back just enough so I could look directly into her eyes. I forgive you, Clara, I said softly, my voice steady and clear. I forgave you the moment I paid that debt. But you need to understand something fundamentally important. Things are going to change. I will no longer be the punching bag for your bad days. I will no longer sit quietly while you belittle my life choices. I love you, but access to my life, to my peace, is a privilege that requires absolute respect. Do you understand? Clara nodded frantically, wiping the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. I understand. I swear it, Ellie. I want to be a real sister to you. Then you can start by coming inside and having breakfast with me and Julian, I said, offering her a genuine, albeit guarded, smile later that evening. After Clara had gone home to begin the arduous task of repairing her own fractured marriage, Julian and I walked down to the edge of the Potomac River. The rain had cleared, leaving a breathtaking canvas of purple and gold painting the twilight sky. Julian slipped his hand into mine, his fingers intertwining perfectly with my own. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Stepping out of the shadows and fully into the light, the following is delivered in a warm, intimate, direct-to-camera aesthetic to everyone listening right now. The hardest battle I ever fought wasn't in a classified military bunker, and it wasn't against a foreign, hostile threat. It was the battle to hold on to my own human dignity when the people closest to me tried desperately to strip it away. We live in a world that loves to put us in neat little boxes. Society tells us that our worth is strictly tied to our job title, the brand of our purse, or the zip code we happen to live in. My sister and her husband bought into that toxic lie. They believed that because I filed papers and wore quiet, unbranded clothes, my heart, my mind, and my fundamental value were somehow less than. But here is the absolute truth. And I need you to hear this deep in your soul. Your worth is inherent. It is not assigned to you by a boss, a spouse, or a highly critical family member. True equality means understanding that the janitor sweeping the floor deserves the exact same den of human respect as the CEO sitting in the corner office. When we judge people based on their superficial labels, we do not expose their flaws, we only expose our own profound ignorance. I didn't heal my family by crushing my brother-in-law with my ultimate authority. I healed that dynamic by showing him what actual, undeniable strength looks like. Compassion, restraint, and refusing to let his arrogance poison my soul. You don't have to be a secret military commander to have absolute power. Your power is your grace. Your power is your ability to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. If this story resonated with you today, if you have ever felt invisible, judged, or looked down upon by the very people who were supposed to love and protect you, I want you to know that you are not alone. Please, hit the like button right now so this message can reach other women who desperately need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of strength and healing. And I truly want to hear from you in the comments. What is one healthy boundary you have set in your life that changed everything for the better? Share your story below. But before you go, I want to leave you with a warning. Healing does not mean you have to be a doormat. Forgiveness is a beautiful gift you give to yourself to release the anger. But access to your daily life is a privilege that must be actively earned. Do not let anyone, no matter how much you love them or share their blood, make you feel small so they can feel tall. Stand firm in your truth, fiercely protect your peace, and never, ever forget the quiet, brilliant power you hold inside. The historic campus of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland was bathed in the crisp, golden light of late October. The air coming off the Severn River was sharp and biting, carrying the distinct scent of salt water and dry, fallen oak leaves. I walked slowly along the brick-paved pathways, my hands tucked deep into the pockets of a tailored wool coat. For the first time in over a decade, I was walking onto a military installation, not as a clandestine phantom hiding in the shadows, but simply as a civilian visitor. I was here to see Arthur. 6 months had passed since the harrowing crisis in the Pacific, and the Sterling family had undergone a profound, almost unrecognizable metamorphosis. The grand, sprawling suburban house with its manicured lawns and echoing, empty halls had been sold. The designer wardrobes and the crippling mountain of secret debt were gone. Clara and Arthur had downsized to a modest, beautiful townhouse just outside the academy grounds. But the most shocking change was not their zip code. It was the total dismantling of Arthur's career. Following the incident, Arthur had voluntarily submitted a formal request to step down from his prestigious fleet command. He had surrendered his path to a fourth star, choosing instead to accept a position as a senior instructor of naval ethics and tactical history. He had traded the intoxicating power of the open ocean for a quiet classroom. I found him standing near the edge of the seawall, watching a team of young midshipmen run drills on the water. He was not wearing his blindingly white dress uniform draped in heavy metals. He wore a simple, dark navy peacoat and a faded gray scarf. The arrogant, puffed-out posture that used to dictate his every movement had completely evaporated. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched a little deeper. But for the first time since I had known him, he actually looked at peace. "They have so much fire in them at that age," Arthur said softly, noticing my arrival without turning around. "They all want to conquer the world. They all want to be the hero on the bridge." I stepped up beside him, resting my forearms against the cold iron railing. "And what do you teach them, Arthur?" He finally turned to look at me, his expression carrying a heavy, earned humility. "I teach them that the most dangerous weapon on any ship is not the missile battery. It is the ego of the commanding officer. I teach them that the moment they believe their rank makes them inherently better than the sailor swabbing the deck, they have already lost the war." A soft, genuine smile touched my lips. Hearing those words coming from a man who used to measure human worth by the price of a wristwatch was nothing short of a miracle. "That is a hard lesson to learn," I murmured, watching the cold waves lap against the stone wall beneath us. "It cost me nearly everything to learn it," Arthur admitted, his voice thick with quiet emotion. "Eleanor, I asked you to come here today because I needed you to see this. I needed you to see that my apology 6 months ago wasn't just born out of fear or the shock of discovering your clearance level. I didn't change because I was terrified of Phantom 6. I changed because you showed me what real strength looks like. You held my entire life in your hands, and instead of crushing me, you pulled me out of the fire. You broke my pride with your absolute grace." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. He opened it, revealing pages of meticulously handwritten notes. "Every morning, I write down the name of Ensign Sarah Jenkins, the young woman whose intelligence report I dismissed because she didn't have enough brass on her collar. I keep her name in my pocket every single day to remind myself of the absolute arrogance that almost cost 3,000 families their loved ones. I will never, as long as I draw breath, disregard a human being to inflate my own sense of importance again." I looked at Arthur, seeing the profound, painful work he had put into tearing down his own toxic foundations. True redemption is not a grand, sweeping gesture made in front of an audience. It is the quiet, agonizing process of dismantling your own ego brick by brick, entirely in the dark. It is unlearning the desperate need to feel superior. "Clara told me she started volunteering at the Veterans Transition Center," I said gently, shifting the focus to my sister. Arthur smiled, a soft, incredibly tender expression crossing his face. "She is thriving, Ellie, without the suffocating pressure of having to maintain that perfect, wealthy illusion. She finally has the space to just breathe. We actually talk to each other now. We sit on the porch, we drink cheap coffee, and we talk. You didn't just save my fleet out there, you saved my marriage." I reached out, placing my hand over his on the cold iron railing. It was the first time I had ever initiated physical contact with him. It was a gesture of absolute forgiveness. A final closing of the door on the painful past. You did the hard work, Arthur. I just pointed you toward the mirror. Now, go teach those kids how to be better leaders than we ever were. The Blue Ridge Mountains provided a breathtaking, sweeping backdrop for the late afternoon sun, casting a warm, romantic glow over the rustic Virginia vineyard. The air smelled of crushed grapes, wild lavender, and the sweet promise of new beginnings. It was exactly 1 year after the stormy confrontation in the Pentagon bunker, and I was standing in front of a floor-length mirror in a quiet bridal suite. I wore a simple, elegant ivory gown, devoid of heavy embellishments or unnecessary theatrics. It felt light, entirely unrestrictive, mirroring the profound freedom I now felt in my own soul. There was a soft knock on the wooden door before it creaked open. Clara stepped into the room, holding a delicate bouquet of white peonies and wild daisies. She wore a beautiful, understated sage green dress. The old Clara would have demanded to be the center of attention, insisting on a lavish, over-the-top country club affair where she could parade her status in front of wealthy acquaintances. The new Clara had spent the entire morning quietly setting up chairs, steaming my veil, and ensuring I had everything I needed without asking for a single ounce of recognition. You look absolutely breathtaking, Ellie, Clara whispered, her eyes shining with unshed happy tears. She walked over and gently handed me the bouquet, carefully adjusting a loose ribbon. Thank you. Clara, I said, looking at our reflection in the glass. For the first time in our lives, we actually looked like sisters. There was no invisible wall of judgment, no underlying current of resentment or competition, just a quiet, foundational love. Julian is waiting, she said softly, reaching out to gently squeeze my hand. And he looks like a man who just won the lottery. Are you ready? I took a deep breath, letting the clean mountain air fill my lungs. I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life. The ceremony took place beneath a sprawling, ancient oak tree, its thick branches offering a beautiful, protective canopy. As I walked down the grassy aisle, my eyes locked immediately onto Julian. He stood at the altar looking impossibly handsome in a sharp charcoal suit. His dark eyes, which had always seen right through my armor to the vulnerable woman underneath, were overflowing with absolute devotion. He was my anchor, the man who had patiently sat with me in the dark until I found the courage to step entirely into the light. When I reached him, he took both of my hands in his thumbs gently brushing over my knuckles. The world around us, the small gathering of close friends, Arthur standing proudly in the front row. The rustling of the leaves faded into a quiet, beautiful blur. Eleanor, Julian began, his voice a steady, rhythmic baritone that resonated deep in my chest. When I first met you, you were carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders, completely in the dark. You spent your life protecting people who didn't even know you existed, and loving people who didn't know how to love you back. But I saw you. I saw your brilliant mind, your fiercely compassionate heart, and your unbreakable spirit. You taught me that true power is not about control. It is about the grace we offer to those who least deserve it. I vow to spend the rest of my days ensuring you never have to hide your brilliance again. I vow to be your sanctuary, your partner, and your greatest champion. Tears streamed freely down my face, warm and healing. I looked at this incredible man, realizing that the era of Phantom 6 had officially come to an end. 2 weeks prior, I had walked into the skiff, placed my black identification plate on the glass table, and submitted my formal resignation from clandestine operations. I had accepted a highly visible, public role as a senior strategic advisor for the Department of Defense, specifically focused on mentoring and elevating female intelligence analysts. I no longer needed to be a ghost. Julian, I replied, my voice trembling slightly but ringing with absolute certainty. For so long, I believed that in order to keep the peace, I had to make myself invisible. I thought love was something I had to earn through silent sacrifice. But you loved me when I was bruised. You loved me when I was broken. And you loved me when I finally found the strength to fight back. You are my safe harbor. With you, I am finally home. As the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Julian pulled me into a deep, passionate kiss, and the small crowd erupted into joyful applause. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the stars began to scatter across the velvet sky, Julian and I stepped away from the glowing lights of the reception. We stood near the edge of the vineyard, his arms wrapped securely around my waist, my head resting against his chest. I looked back at the warm, golden light spilling from the barn windows. I could see Arthur laughing easily with a group of Julian's colleagues, and Clara happily serving slices of wedding cake. The toxic cycle was permanently broken. The suffocating shadows of my past were gone, replaced by the brilliant, undeniable truth of my own worth. I was no longer a lowly secretary, and I was no longer a hidden phantom. I was simply Eleanor, whole, healed, and entirely unashamed of the space I occupied in the world. The sunlight poured generously through the expansive, blast-proof windows of my new office in the E-ring of the Pentagon, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For over a decade, my entire professional existence had been confined to subterranean bunkers, bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of neon tactical screens. I had operated exclusively in the shadows, a faceless entity issuing commands from the dark. But stepping into the light as the senior strategic advisor for the Department of Defense had fundamentally shifted the axis of my world. I was no longer hiding. My name was on the door. My face was visible in high-level briefings. And I was finally occupying the space I had earned with my own blood and intellect. The heavy mahogany door to the main conference room swung open, and I took my seat at the head of a sprawling, polished mahogany table. Today's session was a joint intelligence review, gathering the highest-ranking officers across multiple military branches to assess emerging global cyber threats. To my left sat General Thomas Hastings, a man whose chest was heavily decorated with ribbons and whose entire demeanor radiated the kind of old-guard arrogance that Arthur used to weaponize. To my right sat Lieutenant Maya Lin, a brilliant, 26-year-old signals intelligence analyst. Maya had spent the last 3 sleepless weeks compiling a highly complex predictive model regarding a potential infrastructure hack, and she was visibly nervous, clutching her digital tablet with white-knuckled intensity. When it was Maya's turn to present, she stood up, projecting her meticulously detailed data grids onto the main screen. Her voice shook slightly at first, but as she delved into the algorithmic anomalies she had discovered, her confidence grew. She was outlining a subtle but catastrophic vulnerability in the eastern seaboard's power grid. Before she could even reach her primary conclusion, General Hastings let out a loud, theatrical sigh and tossed his pen onto the table. The sharp clatter echoed in the silent room, a deliberate tactic designed to disrupt her momentum. Lieutenant Lin, with all due respect to the time you've clearly wasted on these spreadsheets, this is purely theoretical anxiety. Hastings interrupted, his tone dripping with thick, condescending paternalism. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. We are dealing with tangible, kinetic threats. I am not going to divert resources because a junior data clerk thinks she spotted a ghost in the machine. Let's leave strategic forecasting to the senior command staff, shall we? A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the room. Maya's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson. She lowered her tablet, her shoulders instantly shrinking as she prepared to apologize and retreat to the invisible margins where young women in this building were traditionally expected to reside. I did not let her step back. I placed my hands flat on the polished table and slowly stood up. The room instantly shifted its focus to me. I did not raise my voice, but I allowed the absolute, unyielding authority of my position to fill every corner of the space. General Hastings, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal edge. You do not dismiss actionable intelligence simply because you lack the technical literacy to comprehend it. And you certainly do not belittle the officers who is doing the work you are incapable of performing. Hastings stiffened, his face reddening. Advisor Vance, I simply meant that her operational experience has successfully mapped a blind spot that your entire division missed. I cut him off smoothly, leaving no room for debate. We do not measure the validity of data by the weight of the brass on the messenger's collar. That exact brand of institutional arrogance is precisely what costs this country lives. Lieutenant Lynn's predictive model is sound, her methodology is flawless, and her conclusions are terrifyingly accurate. I turned my gaze away from the general and looked directly at Maya. I offered her a firm, encouraging nod. Please put your grid back on the screen. Lieutenant, the general is going to sit quietly and take notes so you finish your briefing. Hastings snapped his mouth shut, his jaw tight with silent fury. But he did not dare challenge me. Maya took a deep, stabilizing breath. She lifted her chin, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce gratitude, and she projected her data back onto the wall. She finished her presentation with absolute brilliance, outlining a defensive strategy that would ultimately be adopted by the entire defense network by the end of the week. Later that afternoon, Maya lingered in the hallway outside my office. When I stepped out, she stood at attention, nervously shifting her weight. Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you for earlier. I thought I was going to lose my career for speaking up. I smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You never have to be a phantom to be heard in this building, Maya. You did the work. You hold your ground. We are done shrinking ourselves down to make arrogant men feel comfortable. The scent of roasted rosemary, garlic, and fresh baked bread drifted warmly through the main floor of our Virginia brownstone. It was a crisp Sunday evening in late November, a stark and beautiful contrast to the freezing, suffocating Thanksgiving dinner I had walked away from years ago. The fire was crackling happily in the stone hearth, casting a soft, dancing light across the living room walls. I stood in the open kitchen, effortlessly chopping vegetables while Julian stood beside me, pouring 2 glasses of a robust red wine. His presence was a constant, grounding force, a quiet rhythm of love and respect that had fundamentally rewired my understanding of what a home was supposed to feel like. The sound of genuine, booming laughter echoed from the dining room. Arthur was setting the table, animatedly telling a story about a particularly stubborn midshipman in his naval ethics class. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, looking relaxed and entirely unburdened by the heavy, suffocating ego he used to carry. Clara emerged from the pantry, carrying a stack of linen napkins. She was wearing comfortable jeans and an oversized knit sweater, her face practically glowing with a serene, unpretentious joy. There were no designer labels being flaunted, no passive-aggressive remarks about my career, and no desperate attempts to prove superiority. We were just a family, flawed but finally, miraculously whole. You know, Ellie, Clara said, pausing by the kitchen island to steal a piece of chopped carrot. Arthur's students actually gave him a standing ovation on his last day of the semester. He won't admit it, but he called me from the car afterward and cried. Arthur poked his head around the corner, his cheeks slightly pink. It was allergies, Clara. The pollen count in Annapolis is notoriously aggressive. Julian chuckled, handing me a glass of wine. I'm sure it was. Arthur, just like it was allergies when you teared up during my wedding vows. The room filled with easy, unforced laughter. I leaned my back against the counter, taking a sip of the wine, and just allowed myself to observe the beautiful reality standing in front of me. The transformation of the Sterling family was a testament to the profound, earth-shattering power of establishing absolute boundaries. I had not fixed my family by being a silent martyr, nor had I healed them by using my military authority to crush them into submission. I had saved us by simply refusing to participate in the toxic cycle any longer, by walking away from the table where disrespect was served. I had forced them to sit in the uncomfortable silence of their own behavior, by demanding basic human dignity. I had given them the ultimate opportunity to rise to the occasion. Julian stepped up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. He pressed a soft kiss to my temple, his steady heartbeat thrumming comfortably against my back. You look like you're a million miles away. Advisor Vance, he murmured softly, using my official title with a teasing, affectionate lilt. No, I whispered, leaning back into his solid embrace. For the first time in my life, Julian, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. As we gathered around the heavy wooden dining table, there was no hierarchy. There was no head of the table reserved for the highest ranking officer, and no dark corner designated for the lowly secretary. We passed the food. We shared our triumphs and our mundane daily struggles. And we listened to each other with genuine, unbroken intent. The armor I had worn for so long, the heavy, invisible plates of Phantom 6 that had kept me alive in the dark, had finally been laid to rest. I didn't need it anymore. When the evening eventually wound down and the house grew quiet, I stood alone by the bay window, looking out at the quiet, rain-slicked streets of Washington, D.C. I thought about the thousands of women who were currently sitting at their own suffocating dinner tables, biting their tongues, swallowing their brilliance, and making themselves invisible just to keep the peace. I thought about the crushing weight of the labels society places upon us, and the incredible, terrifying courage it takes to finally rip them off. You do not need a top-secret clearance to command your own life. You do not need silver stars on your shoulders to demand respect. Your worth is a permanent, irrefutable fact of your existence. The moment you stop accepting the cruel narratives that small-minded people try to force upon you, you take your power back. You become the author of your own reality. I had walked through the fire. I had survived the crushing weight of the shadows. And I had finally stepped out into the brilliant, uncompromising light. I was Eleanor Vance Hayes. I was whole. I was visible. And my silence was broken forever. As we reach the end of Eleanor's journey, I want you to take a deep breath and think about the tables you've been sitting at in your own life. How many times have you bitten your tongue just to keep the peace? How often have you let a family member, a partner, or a friend make you feel small just so they could feel big? We are so often taught that family is everything, that we must endure their cruelty simply because of shared blood. But love should never require you to sacrifice your own dignity. Eleanor's ultimate triumph wasn't that she outranked the man who bullied her. Her true victory was in her grace. She showed us that you don't heal your own wounds by destroying the people who hurt you. You heal by setting absolute, unbreakable boundaries. You take your power back the exact moment you realize that your worth is inherent. Your value isn't measured by a job title, the brand of your purse, or the validation of people who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you. If you are listening to this right now and you feel invisible in your own life, please know that your quiet strength is not a weakness. It is a dormant force. You have every right to walk away from conversations that disrespect you. You have the right to demand basic human decency, even from your own sister, your parents, or your spouse. Forgiveness is a beautiful gift you give to yourself to let go of the bitterness. But access to your daily life is a privilege that must be actively earned. Stand firm in your truth, protect your peace, and never forget the brilliant, undeniable power you hold inside. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team to bring meaningful value and life lessons.